The truck's headlights swept across the curtains, and Eleanor's whole body went rigid. 4 minutes before he walked through that door, 4 minutes to decide if tonight would be like every other night, or if the stranger standing in her kitchen would change everything. She'd spent 4 years perfecting the art of disappearing in her own home. Tonight, she wasn't alone in it. He wasn't family. He wasn't even from this town. But he hadn't looked away when everyone else had, and now he stood between her and the one person meant to protect her. The door handle turned. Eleanor no longer knew what was coming, only that for once, she wasn't facing it alone. Eleanor Whitfield had learned, over 71 years of living, that the trick to surviving a bad morning was to keep moving. If she stopped, even for a second, the ache in her shoulder would catch up to her, and then she would have to think about where it came from. And thinking about it was worse than the bruise itself. She pulled her cardigan sleeve down over her wrist and picked up her purse from the kitchen table. The house on Larkspur Lane was quiet, the way it always was at 7 in the morning, before Richard woke up. She liked the quiet. She had learned to need it. Outside, the October air smelled like wet leaves and diesel from the grain trucks that rattled down Route 9 toward the co-op. Maple Ridge was the kind of town where everyone waved from their porches and nobody asked questions they didn't already know the answers to. Eleanor had lived in this town her whole life. She had buried her husband Walter in the cemetery behind the Lutheran church 3 years ago, and she had buried, along with him, the last person who might have noticed when something was wrong. She walked the 6 blocks to Linda's diner because walking cleared her head, and because if she drove, Richard might ask where the car had been. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and Linda Shaw was behind the counter the way she'd been for 20 years, refilling cups without being asked. Eleanor took her usual booth by the window and ordered dry wheat toast and tea, the same thing she'd ordered every Tuesday and Thursday since Walter passed. She didn't notice the motorcycle pull into the gravel lot outside. She didn't notice the man who walked in wearing a weathered leather jacket, boots scuffed pale at the toes, a grey beard trimmed close, and a face that looked like it had spent 40 years in the wind. Frank Coleman wasn't from Maple Ridge. He was passing through on his way to his brother's place 2 counties over, and he'd stopped because the diner had a sign that said hot coffee, and he'd been riding since 5. He noticed her the way people notice small, wrong things without meaning to. She was reaching for the sugar, and her sleeve slipped back an inch, and there it was, a bruise the color of a storm cloud blooming just above her wrist, with the unmistakable shape of fingers pressed too hard. She saw him see it. She pulled the sleeve down so fast her tea nearly tipped, and she gave him the same polite, closed-off smile she gave everyone in this town who almost noticed something. Frank had seen bruises like that before, not on strangers in diners, on his sister, 20 years ago, back when he was young and angry and didn't know what to do except get angrier. He'd learned the hard way that looking away didn't make a person safer. It just made the silence heavier. He didn't say anything that first morning. He ordered his coffee, sat 2 booths down, and watched the old woman eat her toast in small, careful bites, like she was rationing herself. When she left, she walked, not drove, and he noticed that too. He noticed everything now. It was a habit he couldn't turn off anymore, not since his sister. He asked Linda about her before he left. "That's Eleanor Whitfield," Linda said, wiping down the counter. "Sweetest woman in town. Husband passed a few years back. Her son moved in to take care of her." Linda said it, the way people say things they've decided to believe because the alternative is too much trouble to carry. "Moved in to take care of her," Frank repeated. "Richard. Good boy, mostly. Had some trouble a while back, drinking. But he's been better." Linda said this without looking up, the way people recite things they've stopped examining. Frank thanked her and left a $5 tip on a $4 check. He climbed back onto his motorcycle And for the first time in 11 years of riding through towns he never planned to remember, he sat in the gravel lot a long time before starting the engine. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had his own life, folded into 2 saddlebags, a brother waiting 2 counties over, and no good history with getting involved in things that weren't his to fix. The last time he'd tried to fix something like this, it had ended with his knuckles split open and his sister still not safe, not for another 6 months, not until she'd found her own way out. He had learned that a man could care and still be powerless, and that the space between those 2 things could eat a person alive. But he thought about the way Eleanor had pulled her sleeve down. Not startled, practiced, like she'd done it 1,000 times before he ever walked through that door. He started the engine, rode 2 blocks, and turned around. He told himself he'd just get another coffee, just one more look, to be sure he wasn't imagining an old woman's bruise into something bigger than it was. He parked outside the diner again, and through the window he watched Eleanor Whitfield walking home alone down Maple Street, her shoulders drawn in tight against the cold, her sleeve pulled down over her wrist like a secret she'd folded so many times it had become part of her skin. Frank Coleman had planned on being in Maple Ridge for 20 minutes. He didn't leave for 6 weeks. Frank told his brother he'd be delayed. He didn't say why, because he didn't fully know why himself, only that something in him had locked onto Eleanor Whitfield the way a compass needle locks onto north, without asking permission first. He rented a room above the hardware store from a landlord named Gary Prescott, a retired mechanic who didn't ask questions as long as the rent came on time. Gary's shop still had Walter Whitfield's old ledgers in a back drawer, and he mentioned once, without much thought behind it, that Walter had been a fair man who never shorted a customer a nickel. Frank filed that detail away too, the way he filed away everything now. Proof of the kind of household Eleanor had built, and the kind of household that had quietly changed after her husband died. He told himself he'd stay a week, watch a little, make sure he wasn't imagining things. A week became 2. He learned Richard Whitfield's schedule the way he'd once learned a man's temper before deciding whether to trust him. Richard worked mornings at the feed store and spent most afternoons at the Rusty Nail, the one bar in town that stayed open past 9. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with the kind of charm that made bartenders like him and made his mother's neighbors say things like, "Good boy," mostly. Frank started showing up at Linda's diner on the mornings Eleanor came in. He never sat at her table. He never pushed. He'd learned that people who are used to hiding things flinch away from anyone who pushes too hard, too fast. Instead, he let himself become a small, steady presence in the corner. A nod. A morning, ma'am. Nothing that asked anything of her. It was 3 weeks before Eleanor spoke more than a greeting to him. "You're not from here," she said one Thursday, setting her teacup down. "No, ma'am, passing through. Guess I'm passing slow." She almost smiled. It was the first real expression he'd seen cross her face, something underneath the careful blankness she wore like a second cardigan. "Passing slow," she repeated. "That's a nice way to put it." He learned her husband had run the hardware store before Gary bought it. He learned she'd taught 3rd grade for 31 years at Maple Ridge Elementary, and that half the town still called her Mrs. Whitfield, with the particular respect reserved for someone who once held their small hands and taught them to write their names. He learned she had a garden she didn't tend anymore, roses gone leggy and wild along the fence line because bending down had gotten harder, she said, though Frank noticed she never said why. He also learned, from pieces the town let slip without meaning to, that Richard had come back to Maple Ridge 4 years ago after a marriage in Columbus fell apart and a job went with it. He'd moved into his mother's house temporarily, and temporarily had calcified into permanent the way these things do. Eleanor's neighbor, a widow named Dorothy Kane, mentioned once, carefully, that she sometimes heard raised voices through the walls. "But families argue, don't they? and it's really none of my business. None of my business. Frank had heard that phrase in a dozen towns from a dozen people who slept fine at night because they'd convinced themselves that looking away was the same as not knowing. He thought about how easy it was for a town to build a story around a family and then refuse to update it. Eleanor Whitfield had been Mrs. Whitfield, the third-grade teacher for 31 years. The kind woman who brought casseroles to funerals and remembered every child's birthday. Richard had been the boy who once won the county spelling bee and read lessons at church on Christmas Eve. Those old versions of both of them had calcified into the only versions Maple Ridge was willing to see, and nothing that happened behind the walls of the house on Larkspur Lane seemed able to crack that shared, comfortable memory. He started noticing the pattern. Eleanor came to the diner most often on the mornings after what he guessed were Richard's worst nights. Nights he stumbled home from the Rusty Nail with liquor thick on his breath. On those mornings, she wore long sleeves even when the weather didn't call for them, and she moved like her body was negotiating with pain instead of overpowering it. On good weeks, when Richard picked up extra shifts and stayed sober, she was almost light-hearted, telling Frank about her students from 30 years back, about Walter's terrible jokes, about the roses she used to grow. Frank started parking his motorcycle where he could see the Whitfield house from a distance most evenings, not close enough to be obvious, just close enough to know if something was wrong. He told himself he was gathering information, deciding what, if anything, could be done. He knew better than most men what happened when someone charged in without a plan. He'd done that once, at 22 for his sister, and it had cost him a broken hand and hadn't changed a single thing that mattered. The turning point came on a Tuesday in November. Frank was walking past the Whitfield house on his way back from the hardware store, close enough to hear Richard's voice raised through an open window, not the words, just the shape of them, sharp and mean, followed by a silence that felt worse than shouting. Frank stopped on the sidewalk. His hands went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He didn't go to the door. He'd learned that lesson too, that barging into a house uninvited could make everything worse, could give the abuser a reason to punish the victim later for causing a scene. Instead, he stood at the edge of the property until he saw a curtain move, until the voices stopped, until 20 minutes later Richard's truck pulled out of the driveway and rumbled off toward the Rusty Nail. The porch light was off, and the curtains in the front room were drawn tighter than usual, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Frank stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, listening to the wind move through the bare maple branches overhead. Before he made himself walk up the steps, Frank walked to the door and knocked. Eleanor answered with her sleeve already pulled down, her face arranged into its practiced calm, and when she saw him, something in her expression cracked, just slightly, like ice giving under weight it wasn't built to hold. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "this isn't a good time." "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I'm here." She didn't let him in that night. She stood in the doorway with the porch light casting long shadows across her face, and she told him, in a voice that shook only a little, that everything was fine, that Richard had a temper, but he loved her, that he'd lost his job and his marriage, and this house was all he had left, and didn't Frank understand what it was like to watch your own child struggle? Frank stood on the step below her, close enough to see her hands trembling around the doorframe, and he thought about how many times she must have rehearsed this exact speech, smoothing its edges until it sounded almost reasonable. He'd heard versions of it before, in his sister's voice, 20 years back, the same instinct to protect the person causing the harm, as though naming the wound out loud might make it permanent in a way that silence never could. Frank understood something else, that this was the story she'd been telling herself for 4 years, worn smooth from repetition, the way a stone gets smooth from a river running over it again and again. He didn't argue with her that night. He'd learned from his sister that arguing with the story someone tells themselves to survive only makes them cling to it harder. "I'm not going anywhere," was all he said. "I'll be around." Over the following 2 weeks, Frank found himself doubting his own judgment more than once. Maybe Linda was right, and Richard really was a good man having a hard stretch. Maybe Eleanor's bruises came from a fall, from her age, from 100 ordinary things that had nothing to do with her son. He was a stranger in this town, an outsider with a leather jacket and a criminal-sounding nickname the local kids had already given him, the biker. And he had no legal standing, no proof, nothing but a feeling in his gut that had once been right about his sister and had cost him everything to act on. He almost left. He packed his saddlebags on a grey Sunday morning, told himself he'd done what he could, that a grown woman had the right to make her own choices, even if he didn't agree with them. He thought about his brother 2 counties over, who'd called twice already asking when Frank planned on showing up, and about the simple, uncomplicated life of a man just passing through, untangled from other people's houses and other people's grief. He sat on his motorcycle outside Gary's hardware store, with the engine idling, ready to ride to his brother's and never look back. The engine's low rumble filled the quiet street, and for a moment Frank let himself imagine the open road ahead of him, the wind, the miles, the easy forgetting that came with distance. It would have been simple. Nobody in Maple Ridge would have blamed him for leaving. Most of them had never even noticed he'd stayed this long. Then he saw Dorothy Kane hurrying down the sidewalk toward the diner, her face pale, and something in her posture made him cut the engine and follow. Dorothy was telling Linda that she'd heard something break next door the night before. Glass, she thought, or a dish. And then Eleanor's voice. And then quiet. The bad kind of quiet, and she hadn't known whether to call anyone because what if it was nothing? What if she made trouble over nothing? Frank walked straight to the Whitfield house. He didn't knock this time. He stood on the porch until Eleanor opened the door, and when she did, he saw what he'd been afraid he'd see, a split at the corner of her lip, carefully covered with a dab of makeup that didn't quite match her skin, and eyes that had the flat, faraway look of someone who has decided that surviving today is the only goal worth having. "You need to let someone help you," Frank said. "He's my son," Eleanor whispered, and for the first time her voice cracked all the way through. "If I call the police, if I tell anyone, he goes to jail, and then what? He has nowhere else. I raised him. This is my fault, somehow. It has to be." Frank had heard this kind of thinking before, the way victims twist the blame back onto themselves because it feels more bearable than admitting the person who's supposed to love them has become dangerous. He crouched down slightly, so he wasn't looming over her, and he spoke as gently as his rough voice allowed. "It's not your fault, not one piece of it, but I can't make you believe that today. I just need you to know I'm not leaving, and when you're ready, I'll help you do whatever you decide to do. Not before you're ready, but I'm not going anywhere." She didn't answer. She closed the door gently, and Frank stood on the porch a long moment before walking away, feeling the old, familiar helplessness of caring about someone he couldn't force to save herself. That night, he called a number he hadn't used in years, an old friend from his riding days, Mike Sanders, who now worked as a victim's advocate for a domestic violence shelter 2 counties over. They'd ridden together back when Frank was young enough to think anger could fix things, and Mike had gone a different way after watching his own mother go through something similar. Mike listened to the whole situation without interrupting, asking only a few careful questions about how long the pattern had gone on and whether Eleanor had ever named it out loud. And then he told Frank something that reshaped the entire plan. "You can't rescue her, Frank. Not the way you're thinking. She has to choose it, or it won't stick, and she could be in more danger if you push too hard, too fast. What you can do is make sure that when she's ready, there's somewhere safe for her to go, and someone who believes her the second she says the word." Frank spent the next several days quietly building that safety net instead of trying to force a rescue. He learned the number for the county's domestic violence hotline. He learned that the local sheriff's department had a deputy, Tom Brennan, who specialized in elder abuse cases and had a reputation for taking them seriously instead of writing them off as family matters. He learned that Ohio law allowed for a civil protection order that could remove Richard from the house without Eleanor having to press criminal charges immediately if she chose that path. He was patient. He waited, through a week of watching Eleanor's careful smile grow thinner, through a Sunday when he saw Richard's truck peel out of the driveway well past midnight and didn't return until dawn, through the small, private grief of knowing something bad was building and being unable to stop it before it happened. He kept the hotline number folded in his wallet. He kept Deputy Brennan's card in his jacket pocket. He waited the way a man waits for weather he can see coming but cannot outrun, doing what preparation he could in the meantime. And on a cold Thursday morning in early December, Eleanor walked into the diner, moving slower than usual, one arm held stiff and close to her body. And instead of taking her usual booth by the window, she sat down across from Frank for the first time in 6 weeks and said the words he'd been waiting to hear. "I'm scared, Mr. Coleman. Last night, he grabbed me by the arm so hard I thought something might break. I don't know what to do." Frank didn't waste the moment. He called Mike Sanders from the diner parking lot while Eleanor sat inside with Linda, wrapped in a blanket Linda kept behind the counter for exactly this kind of morning, though Linda had never quite let herself admit why she kept it there. Within an hour, a plan had taken shape. One built not on impulse, but on the careful groundwork Frank had spent weeks laying, quietly, without ever pushing Eleanor toward a decision she wasn't ready to make. Deputy Tom Brennan agreed to meet Eleanor privately at the sheriff's substation that afternoon, away from Richard's schedule at the feed store, to document her injuries and explain her legal options without any pressure to decide on the spot. Brennan had handled 2 other elder abuse cases in the county over the past 5 years, both involving adult children, and he'd learned that the worst thing a responding officer could do was make the victim feel like she was the one on trial. Eleanor sat in Deputy Brennan's office with her sleeves rolled up for the first time in years, and a young female officer photographed the bruising that mapped 4 years of silence across her arms. Brennan was patient and steady, the way Frank had promised he would be, and by the end of the meeting, Eleanor had signed the paperwork for an emergency protection order. It wouldn't take effect until it was served, Brennan explained, which meant tonight, before Richard came home expecting the same silence he'd always been given, someone needed to be there to keep Eleanor safe. Frank volunteered before anyone finished asking. He drove Eleanor home himself, and Deputy Brennan followed in a separate cruiser, parked a block away, ready but not looming, respecting Eleanor's plea that this not turn into a spectacle the whole town would gossip about by morning. Frank stayed in the kitchen with Eleanor as the afternoon stretched into evening, and for the first time she talked without editing herself. About the year after Walter died, when Richard's calls turned from comforting to controlling, about the first time he'd grabbed her wrist over an argument about money, about how each incident had seemed small enough, alone, to explain away until the sum of 4 years sat on her chest like a stone she could no longer lift. The hours between Eleanor signing the paperwork and Richard's expected return home stretched long and taut. Frank kept the kitchen lights low and the conversation quiet, letting Eleanor set the pace, letting her talk when she wanted, and sit in silence when she needed that instead. Outside, the December evening settled over Larkspur Lane in the particular deep blue that comes just before true dark, and somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and went quiet. At 7:15, headlights swept across the living room curtains. Richard's truck pulled into the driveway harder than usual, gravel spitting under the tires, and Frank felt Eleanor go rigid beside him, her teacup rattling faintly against its saucer. "Stay behind me," Frank said quietly. "Deputy Brennan's right outside. You're not alone tonight." Richard came through the front door already agitated, his voice rising before he'd even closed it behind him. some complaint about his shift, about money, about a life he felt cheated out of. He stopped short when he saw Frank standing in the kitchen doorway, calm, arms loose at his sides, not aggressive, just immovable. "Who the hell is this?" Richard said, and Frank watched the familiar shift happen in his face, the recalculation of a man used to controlling a room, realizing the room had changed shape without his permission. "My name's Frank Coleman. Your mother asked me to be here. This is a family matter. Get out of my house." "It's her house," Frank said, his voice even, "and she's asked for help. There's a deputy outside. This can go easy or it can go hard, but either way, tonight's the night this stops." Richard's face went through anger, disbelief, and something like fear in the space of a few seconds. He looked between Frank and his mother, and then at the kitchen itself, as if trying to understand how the room he'd controlled for 4 years had suddenly stopped belonging to him. He turned toward his mother, and for a moment Frank saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the old manipulation rising up, the guilt trip, the wounded son performance that had worked on Eleanor for 4 years. "Mom, tell him this is nothing. Tell him you're fine." Eleanor stepped out from behind Frank, and her voice, when it came, was quieter than Frank expected, but steadier than he'd ever heard it. "I'm not fine, Richard. I haven't been fine in a long time, and I let myself believe it was my job to carry that, so you wouldn't have to face what you'd become. I can't do that anymore. I love you, but I'm afraid of you, and a mother shouldn't be afraid of her own son in her own kitchen." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Richard's face cracked between fury and something closer to shame, and for one terrible second, Frank saw his hand curl into a fist at his side. Frank stepped forward, not swinging, not threatening, just placing himself solid and unmoving between Richard and Eleanor. "Deputy's right outside," Frank said again, low and even. "Don't make tonight worse than it has to be." Richard's shoulders dropped. Whatever violence had been building in him collapsed, not into remorse, but into the deflated posture of a man who'd finally run out of an audience willing to excuse him. Deputy Brennan knocked at the door moments later, drawn by the raised voices, and served the protection order calmly, professionally, explaining that Richard would need to gather essential belongings and leave the property for the night, with a hearing scheduled within the week to determine next steps. Richard left cursing under his breath about ungrateful mothers and interfering strangers, but he left. The truck's headlights swept back across the curtains and faded down Larkspur Lane, and for the first time in 4 years, Eleanor Whitfield stood in her own kitchen without flinching at the sound of an engine. She sat down hard at the kitchen table, and Frank watched something enormous move through her body. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first crack in 4 years of held breath. Outside, Deputy Brennan's cruiser pulled away slowly, its taillights fading down Larkspur Lane, and the house settled into a silence that felt, for the first time in a long while, like safety instead of fear. "I don't know what happens now," she said. "Now," Frank said, sitting down across from her, "you get to find out." The hearing took place 8 days later at the county courthouse, a squat brick building 40 minutes from Maple Ridge, with a flag hanging still in the cold morning air outside its doors. Eleanor sat beside a legal aid attorney Mike Sanders had connected her with, a young woman named Susan Park, who specialized in elder abuse cases and who treated Eleanor's fear with the same seriousness Deputy Brennan had shown from the start. Frank sat 2 rows behind her, close enough that she could turn and find him if she needed to, far enough that the hearing remained hers to carry. Richard appeared with a court-appointed lawyer and offered no serious contest to the protective order. The photographed injuries, Deputy Brennan's report, and Eleanor's own steady testimony left little room for the old excuses to hold. When it came time for Eleanor to speak, her voice carried further than anyone in that courtroom expected, steady in a way it had never been able to be inside her own kitchen. The judge granted a full year's protection order, with mandatory counseling and an alcohol treatment program as conditions should Richard ever petition to have it lifted. Maple Ridge, as small towns do, found out everything within a week, in pieces, through the particular telegraph of a diner counter and a church parking lot. Some of it was unkind. A few voices insisted Eleanor should have kept family business private, that airing it brought shame on a good family name. But more voices, quietly and then less quietly, admitted what Dorothy Kane had admitted to Frank the week before, that they'd heard things, suspected things, and told themselves it wasn't their business to know. Linda Shaw cried behind her own counter the day the story got around, not from surprise, she admitted, but from the guilt of having served Eleanor toast every Tuesday and Thursday for years without ever asking the question underneath her polite smile. Eleanor didn't leave Maple Ridge. She'd lived her whole life in that house, and she decided, with a stubbornness Frank found he deeply admired, that she would not be the one to run. Instead, something in the town itself seemed to shift around her, slowly, the way a field changes after a hard winter finally breaks. Dorothy Kane started walking with her to the diner some mornings, no longer content to only listen through the wall and wonder. Deputy Brennan checked in without being asked, sometimes just a wave from his cruiser window, sometimes a few minutes on the porch over coffee. And Linda began setting aside the good scones, the ones she usually saved for Sunday, for Eleanor's Tuesday mornings, a small, quiet apology in pastry form for 2 years of dry wheat toast, served without ever asking the question underneath it. A few of Eleanor's former students, grown now with children of their own, stopped by the house that winter once word had gotten around, bringing casseroles the way she used to bring them to others, as if the whole town was slowly repaying a debt it hadn't realized it owed her. Frank stayed in Maple Ridge through the winter. He told himself, at first, it was only to make sure the protection order held, to be a steady presence in case Richard tried to test the boundaries the court had drawn. But somewhere in the grey weeks of January, watching Eleanor slowly straighten her shoulders, watching her laugh, a real laugh, not the careful closed thing she used to offer strangers, Frank admitted to himself that he'd stopped thinking about leaving at all. He helped her clear the overgrown rosebed along the fence line that spring, the two of them working in comfortable silence, Eleanor directing him on which canes to cut back and which to leave, telling him stories about Walter's terrible jokes and her 31 years of small handwriting lessons. She showed him an old photograph she kept in a kitchen drawer, herself at 26, standing beside these same rose bushes, newly planted, Walter's arm around her shoulders and a whole unwritten life stretching out ahead of them. Frank looked at the photograph a long moment before handing it back. Frank, who had spent most of his adult life believing that caring about people only ever led to broken hands and unfinished rescues, found something different taking root in Maple Ridge, proof that sometimes patience, not force, was the thing that actually saved someone. He'd spent 2 decades treating his sister's story as a wound that never fully closed, a reminder of how little one man could do against a problem too large and too private for outsiders to touch. Watching Eleanor slowly become herself again, watching the town learn, imperfectly but honestly, to see what it had spent years refusing to notice, Frank began to let that old wound close a little for the first time. Richard completed his counselling requirements at the edge of what the court demanded and no further, and moved to Columbus after the year's order expired, calling his mother on holidays in a voice that had learned, at least, to be careful. Eleanor answered those calls with a kindness that no longer cost her anything, because it was freely given now, not extracted through fear. On a warm evening in early June, Frank sat with Eleanor on her porch, the roses finally blooming wild and unruly along the fence the way she'd always wanted them, and she turned to him with the same careful, searching look she'd given him that first morning at the diner when she'd caught him noticing her sleeve. "You could have kept riding," she said. That first day, most people do. Frank considered the roses, the porch, the quiet street where nobody's headlights made anyone flinch anymore. "Some things," he said, are worth turning around for. Eleanor Whitfield had spent 4 years believing that no one in Maple Ridge would ever really look at her, would ever see past the careful sleeves and the practiced smile to the truth underneath. It had taken a stranger passing through, a man the town had been quick to judge by his leather jacket and his motorcycle, to prove her wrong, and in doing so, to teach an entire town the cost of looking away, and the quiet, enormous power of choosing finally to see. That summer, Frank sold his brother on the idea of settling in Maple Ridge instead, at least for a while, and Gary Prescott offered him steady work at the hardware store Walter had once run, the kind of small, ordinary life Frank had never let himself want before. In the evenings, he still rode out along Route 9 when the restlessness in him needed somewhere to go, but he always came back before dark, and Eleanor always left the porch light on.